Well, the results are in, and BC has officially voted in the NDP. David Eby is going to be our next Premier of British Columbia. We're going to talk about that as well as some of their housing promises and a housing promise from Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party, in the federal election, what he promises to do if he gets elected as the next Prime Minister of Canada. That and more as we go into our next episode of Manning Up After Dark on the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast. You're listening to the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast with your host, Cameron Manning. We bring you the industry experts each episode who will help you man up on your real estate career. Let's dive into it here. BC NDP has officially won another election. However, it's still to be announced if it's going to be a majority government or if it's going to be a minority government. And that's where things are still up in the air. We've been covering the election over the last couple of weeks on this podcast, and it's been a nail biter since day one. In fact, it was a historical election when it came to the Conservative government, or the Conservative Party, I should say, coming out and suddenly being a player. They haven't been a player since the 1930s. And in fact, on the last election, they only had about 2% of the votes. Now they're sitting well over 43% of the votes. And this was one of the closest margins in many ridings that we have ever seen. And because of how close it is in two ridings, it is yet to be determined if they are going to be taking that majority on the NDP side or if it will be a minority. Now, we did talk about it on the last episode, and the concerns I have, obviously, if it's a minority government, is the two elected officials for the Green Party could potentially have some sway in what's going to happen in British Columbia if they are a minority government. The BC NDP are going to be looking to the Greens to hopefully form some sort of a coalition. That means that they will get the Greens on their side, but that means the Greens will be able to bring some demands that they would like to see from the NDP to, basically they will vote with you on certain topics. However, if it is announced that the NDP get the majority, well, that allows them to have, in essence, the opportunity to pass almost anything that they would like to do here in British Columbia and make significant changes to what they've done. Now, it's interesting because obviously they're just coming off having a majority government and they've already made significant changes, but the BC NDP leader, David Eby, even went on stage and said that he has heard what British Columbians are wanting and they have to make changes based on some of the stuff that they have done. One of the biggest things is obviously he's pulled back on his drug policy, and that's something that's been a big topic on the election platform. So that's going to be an interesting one to see what he does there. But more focused on this specific podcast is their housing. So we are going to talk a little bit about one of his biggest housing pledges and what it really means to British Columbians and how it's going to roll out. There's not a lot of news on it yet, so we're going to cover that. And then obviously we'll talk a little bit about what Pierre Poilievre has also announced for one of his campaign pledges as we head towards a federal election probably into the next year. All right, let's talk about it. Let's pull up the screen here. The counting still isn't done in BC's election. Here's what happens next. So there's going to be a judicial recount of two ridings because these two ridings are still so close that they can't actually call it yet. So this is going to be happening on September 8th, 7th and 8th. And the BC NDP just needs to win one of these ridings in order to form a majority government. Now, they are currently leading in the Surrey-Guildford area. If we pull it up here, we can see the riding that Surrey-Guildford is in, which as of Monday saw the NDP's Gary Begg ahead of Hanveer Singh Randhawa of the Conservative Party of BC by just 27 votes. This is how crazy it is. Now, one of the things that I want to point out with this election, when you have people that say, I don't vote because my vote doesn't matter, could you imagine if more people who felt that way were voting maybe one way or the other, how much of a different election this could have been? So many people don't want to vote because they feel that with the thousands of people voting, if everyone's going one way, their vote's not going to matter. This proves it wrong. Your votes absolutely do matter. With a margin of only 27 votes, this is some of the closest election results we have seen in years. And again, historically, that it's the Conservatives that are bringing the heat to the NDP. Now, the other riding here, which currently is Conservative led right now by only 38 votes, is the Kelowna Centre. So if either of these get announced as they sit, or if either of them flip, that could be major changes for what the government's going to look like. One, if it stays the same and BC NDP wins Surrey-Guildford, we have a majority government. If that riding as well as Kelowna flip to Conservatives, will be in a minority government. And of course, if both of them go to NDP, we have the majority government. going to be very interesting to watch. And this judicial recount is really going to make a huge difference on how the government is going to play out. As I said, David Eby is the premier now of British Columbia, as it is going to be an NDP government. It's really just up to which side is it going to be on, majority or minority. So we're definitely going to have to watch that over the next weekend, and we will be tracking it here on the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is David Eby's plan for BC housing. I think it's very important that we cover this because, to me, this sounds a little bit of a rinse and repeat of something they tried, with obviously some tweaks in order to improve it and see if it's going to actually impact. I don't know how many people are going to get on board with this. They're going to have to do a much better job marketing than their last time. But that is that the BC NDP promises to finance a portion of thousands of new homes if they're reelected. Now, the reason why I say this is kind of a rinse and repeat is there was a financing program involved recently in pre-pandemic that I had actually some clients took advantage of. But the problem with it is that, one, the government doesn't move as fast as the market does. When we were trying to deal with a purchase for a client doing some sort of a provincially backed program that allowed them to purchase a property, it took a lot longer on the subjects, and most sellers out there are not willing to wait. So it'll interesting to see which types of homes qualify for this, and again, how it's really going to roll out and if it will actually impact housing in a significant way. So we can see here, David Eby and BC NDP promises $1.29 billion to help first-time homebuyers get into housing if market if re-elected. The plan calls for the province to finance 40% of the cost of a home for middle income earners. And we can see further down here, middle income is anyone earning less than $131,950 household income. So that's combined between two parties in the house. Essentially what it is that you'd only need to get a mortgage of up to 60% of the cost, with the government providing a low interest loan to cover the remaining 40%. I'm curious how this is going to roll out with banks. First of all, you can make this announcement all you want, but will the banks be willing to do this sort of a lending program where they lend 60% and the government lends 40%? Essentially, it sounds like that's meaning 100% financing for homes. I don't know how many banks are going to be comfortable with that, seeing as typically they like to see some sort of a down payment. They're mitigating if any fluctuations in the market. If the market goes down, but you've put a down payment, at least the bank's position is potentially secured. If you try to sell a property and the market is down, well, does that mean that the government's willing to take a bit of a loss? I really doubt it. I'm curious to see what that agreement is going to look like. Basically, Eby says that it's compared to some sort of a rental agreement between the province and MST Development Corporation that will see 2,600 homes available as similar financing agreement. So essentially, going back up here, the buyers would repay the loan when they sold the unit, and the province would also be entitled to 40% of the increase in the home's equity. I'm confused myself on the low interest loan. Is the low interest just 40% of the home equity, or is there going to be some sort of an interest payment on top of that? There's a lot to be seen when it comes to this housing promise from David Eby's government and how it's actually going to roll out. Essentially, the loan would have to be repaid upon the sale of a property, which that makes sense, or 25 years after the purchase date. So if you own the property for 25 years, at the 25-year mark, you would be required to pay the loan. Now, obviously, by year 25, that property should have gone up in value, and you potentially have paid off a majority of your mortgage at that time. However, it goes to the fact that they do require 40% of the increased equity. So if you have to pay them out because you're still not selling the home, you have to either refinance and get an appraisal for what that property value is and give them that 40% plus 40% of the equity earned, or you'd have to sell the home at that time. There's a lot to be really unpacked here and what it's actually going to mean to homeowners who actually try to take advantage of this. Now, again, this is just a pledge. This is not a formal actual program that they've put in place yet, but we're going to want to watch that because I have seen in my career a program that helped buyers get financing for a portion of their down payment, and either one, it wasn't marketed properly, not a lot of people took advantage of it, but two, it was difficult for buyers to qualify because they had to mix that in with the bank qualifying, and it just meant that there was a lot of backlog when it came to people actually buying homes. So there's a lot of layers we're going to have to unpack here and see how they roll this out and see how banks actually take a look at this as well. Because again, 100% financing is something that most banks aren't really interested in funding. So we'll have to really watch that. The next thing I want to talk about really quickly, this is going to be a fairly quick episode, is the fact that Pierre Poilievre has also made an announcement in regards to housing if he gets elected in 2025 as the next Prime Minister of Canada. What he is pledging now, I'm very interested in this because I do sell a lot of new construction homes. And obviously one of the biggest difficulties is the fact that there is GST on that. In fact, for those who don't know, the government has basically made it so that they can actually double dip twice on GST on the same property, but that's a whole other topic for another time. But if you've been selling pre-construction and reassigning them and or selling them after that you've closed on them, there is a system in place for the government to get GST twice. So we'll maybe cover that in another episode. But taking a look at it here, Pierre Poilievre pledges to remove GST from purchases of new homes sold for under $1 million. Now, this is huge for markets specifically across Canada, but specifically in areas like Vancouver and Toronto, where most people are having to buy in attached properties anyways. And there's a significant amount of development that's happening. However, at the same token, properties in Alberta or Saskatchewan, Manitoba that are under $1 million detached, this obviously should affect them as well. So he promises to remove GST from new homes and rental with rental prices below market value. So again, I'm curious as this gets rolled out. When he talks about rental with below market value, does this mean it's a target for specifically investors buying properties who plan to create housing and rent them out? Or is this for specifically developers who build and hold? Or is this for anyone buying a new home for themselves? So let's get further into the article here. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is pledging to eliminate, we talked about if he wins the federal election. He made this announcement on Monday in a campaign style video released online and held a media conference in Ottawa to provide more details. He said, and in quotes, the GST was not meant to apply to the basic necessities of food and housing, Pierre Poilievre said on Monday. Conservatives say the move could save Canadians $40,000 to $40,000 on an $800,000 house and would spur the construction of an additional 30,000 homes in Canada every year. Again, this announcement builds on pledge by Poilievre to remove GST on construction of any new homes with rental prices below market values. Businesses will pass on those savings because if they don't, then buyers will buy from someone else. That is what competition means. Now, what I really like about what he just said there, and I think it's missing from a lot of policies that government's been putting in place, the more competition we create, the more it's going to balance out the cost of goods, and goods include housing as well. The more competition we create, the more choice buyers have, the more competitive with pricing developers have to be, landlords have to be, everything. The biggest thing that we can do to solve our housing crisis is to create incentives to create more housing. It's basic economics at the end of the day. Like, I just don't understand how people don't see that, and they say, well, we're going to go after the demand, we're going to go after bad landlords and speculators, and we're going to increase taxes, restrictions. To solve the housing crisis is create more supply. More supply means more competition, means prices are going to stay level. Now, let's see here. Kevin Leese, the Canadian Home Builder Association, said that he is also confident home builders will pass these savings on because they need housing to be affordable. If people can't buy, then builders can't build houses, and that's why we don't have as many housing starts as we need right now. Anything that's going to lower the actual selling price of a home, which would empirically is going to help create more housing supply. So again, people understand that developers are not sitting there trying to say, okay, well, hey, if we can not have to remit this GST, we can increase prices, because the more people that try to do something like that, maybe they're not going to get the sales. The market determines the value, and buyers will buy where they see value in the market. So a developer passing on any sort of savings that they can to a buyer is going to actually yield sales. When they get sales, they can get their projects built and move on to the next project. It is a churn and burn kind of system that they need to do because that is their business model. They need to build, they need to sell. And if they don't sell because they're not being as competitive on their pricing, they are going to be stuck with product and buyers are going to buy elsewhere. Again, it is just basic economics of business and supply and demand. So I'm very interested to see what kind of impact this announcement is going to have. I really believe that, in my opinion, and I've said it on my platforms before, if we want more housing and we want more affordability, we have to cut red tape. We have to stop taxing the living hell out of everything. And we got to stop penalizing people who are actually doing the job that the government wants, which is to provide housing. If you want more housing affordability, we need to basically incentivize developers to build. If we want more rentals, we need to incentivize landlords to be able to build. I don't know if you guys just saw that. Something on my computer gave me a thumbs up there. So, hey, at least it's agreeing with us. So we need to do a lot of things here in Canada and in the province of British Columbia to stop penalizing people. And we need to start incentivizing so that we can create more housing inventory. That housing inventory will create competition. And when competition happens, we'll actually start to see lowering of prices. Now, the biggest thing is obviously on the other side of that, we have to look at where the demand is coming from. If we continue to bring in more and more people into this country, and I'm not saying we don't need immigration, we just have to make sure we're watching the flow of it, is that it puts pressure on an already pressurized system here. As we bring more Canadians, they need housing. When they need housing and we're not building it as fast, we're going to see more pressure. So as an investor, if you're listening to this podcast, if you continue to believe that we are going to increase our supply or our demand by bringing in more people, well, now's the right time to buy, because obviously with the current market, the stuff that the government has done, obviously raising interest rates and putting all these penalties in place, it has impacted the market. But long term, if we're not increasing the housing starts and we are continuing to bring more Canadians in, if you continue to believe that's going to happen, then investing in real estate long term is always going to be a good play. So now might be a good time to get into the market. That's just my opinion. You have to do your own independent research, of course. But if you believe that we're going to continue to see that pressure, you're probably going to profit long term and do very, very well in the markets, though you have to navigate all these changes and nuances that the governments have put into place. That is my updates right now. This was the Manning Up After Dark series. It's a weekly series we've been doing that we just have a frank conversation, you and I, what's happening out there that you need to be aware of if you're investing in real estate or if you're a realtor or any sort of real estate related professional, and keeping up to date with the current events. Now, if you guys enjoyed this episode of the podcast, of course, make sure you guys give me a high rating, 5-star rating on wherever you're listening to this podcast. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, give me a thumbs up and drop some comments below. I'm curious, do you feel that any of these programs that the NDP or the Conservative federally are talking about are going to make any sort of an impact when it comes to housing here in British Columbia and in Canada in general? And of course, if you've seen extreme value from these podcasts, hit that subscribe button. Every single one of you who hits that subscribe and turns on the bell helps me grow this channel, and it helps me continue to be able to deliver this information to you so you can continue to stay as up to date as possible and make the right decision for your business. Thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode of Manning Up After Dark on the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast.